Okay, so what are these triggers? Let's start with number 8. Coming in at number 8 are food items, which were reported by 27% of the participants in that study. What specific foods? All right, so you have dark chocolate, you have cheese because of the tyramine content, you have milk, you have caffeine, you have additives such as aspartame and MSG, you have nitrites in smoked meats and preserved meats. Caffeine can be tricky because both caffeine and caffeine withdrawal can actually trigger headaches, depending on the person and also on the dose of how much caffeine that person was taking per day. And it's important to distinguish between a migraine triggered by caffeine and caffeine withdrawal syndrome, which is a separate entity. All right, on to number 7, alcohol. Several alcoholic beverages have been reported to trigger migraines. In the study that I mentioned earlier, as many as 38% of participants identified alcohol as being a trigger for them. Now, not all alcohols are created equally. The most commonly cited alcohol that can trigger migraines is actually red wine. However, theoretically, any alcoholic beverage can trigger a migraine. And that is mostly because of the effect of the alcoholic metabolites, which lead to vasodilation and can lead to increase in CGRP, which is a pain molecule in the brain. However, red wine seems to have additional compounds, such as phenols and sulfites, which are implicated in the generation of the migraine. Okay, coming in at number 6, 44% of patients in that study identified sensory stimuli, such as odors, lights, and sounds as being a common trigger for their migraines. Now, specifically, perfumes and paints and gasoline can be identified as common triggers. Bright lights for a lot of patients can be a trigger, and similarly, loud noises can be a trigger. I have a couple of patients in my headache clinic who commented that the fragrance diffuser in the lobby triggered a migraine for them. So by the time I saw them in the exam room, they were already having a migraine that was unfortunately triggered by us because of whatever smell was being used in the lobby. My team to change it. After I got that feedback, obviously I asked my team to change that and to remove it from the lobby. Coming strong at number 5 are sleep disturbances, which were identified by 50% of participants in that study as being a trigger for their migraines. Now, it's important to keep in mind the caveat that sleep and migraines have somewhat of a bidirectional comorbid relationship, in the sense that if you have a bad headache all day and at night, you may not be able to sleep well at night. And then also, if you didn't really get proper sleep on a given night, you're more likely to have a headache the next morning. So it seems to go both ways. Moving on to number 4 are weather changes, which were identified by 53% of the participants in the study. Several studies have looked at specific weather parameters to see which ones are more likely to trigger a migraine. However, the jury is still out as to whether it's a humidity, the temperature itself, a drop or a rise in temperature, barometric pressure, that is the most likely to trigger a migraine. Depending on the study, it could be any of these parameters. One thing I will tell you is that a lot of my patients tell me that they are a walking barometer and they can usually predict weather changes based on their headaches, which I found funny and relatively accurate. All right, can you guess what the top 3 are now that we have eliminated the other factors? All right, coming in at number 3 is fasting, so not eating. And we talked about specific foods earlier at number 8. However, fasting in itself is a significantly higher risk factor for triggering a migraine. So 57% of participants identified fasting as being a significant trigger for their migraines. And it seems to be proportional to the duration of the fast. So the longer you fast, the more likely you are to get a migraine. Some of these studies were done on patients who simply did not eat breakfast in the morning and therefore were more likely to get a headache afterward. However, longer-term studies were done in using Ramadan and Yom Kippur and identified fasting as being a very significant trigger for migraines. So make sure to eat at regular intervals and make sure to identify whether fasting is a trigger for you, because that one is easy to change. Coming strong at number 2 are hormonal influences. In 65% of patients, obviously we're only talking about the female population, but this is a very significant trigger. Migraines have been shown repeatedly to be a very estrogen-dependent disorder, and they are significantly more common in women. Drops in estrogen specifically can be a trigger for migraines, whether that is during the menstrual cycle or potentially during pregnancy or after pregnancy. All right, are you ready for number 1? 80% of participants in the study identified emotional stress as being the most significant trigger for their migraines. I wasn't surprised to see stress on the list. However, I was definitely surprised to see it at number 1. Unfortunately, not much can be done about stress. A lot of us are stressed out due to various factors, and some of it may be in your control, but some of it is not, which makes it a little bit tricky. An additional thing that can make it tricky is the fact that stress is also related to some of the other factors we mentioned earlier. For example, sleep. So it's not necessarily a pure trigger. But it's important to keep in mind so that, let's say you're having a month with an increased frequency of headaches, and it happens to also be a month when you're very stressed out because of work or studies, then it's important to keep in mind that that could be the reason why you're having that increased frequency of the headaches, and to try to decrease the stress in your life as much as possible. Alright, those were the 8 triggers I wanted to discuss today. Let me know in the comments below if you found any of these triggers to be surprising, or if you felt that I missed any triggers that may have been a trigger for you. One thing I always recommend to my patients is to keep a headache diary, either a journal or potentially an app. There are many apps these days like Migraine Buddy, for example, and those will help you track the triggers. So whenever you have a headache, you would basically log it in the app. It will ask you if you had any alcohol the day before. It will ask you if there was any weather changes, how your sleep was the night prior. So that can help you ultimately get a statistical idea of what the triggers are for you. Please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel. I hope you liked the video. Thanks again for your attention, and stay safe.